Credit goes to Daniel Spino, longtime Oak Island researcher and theorist. Scott Clark has an interesting theory regarding the Rhodolite Garnet piece that was found on what was Lot 8 on Oak Island. It was detailed in Season 5, Episode 16 of The Curse of Oak Island. The lot at one time belonged to Dr. Jonathan Prescott. There has been speculation that the piece was a brooch or piece of treasure, but Clark believes that it could be a part of a Masonic Royal Arch High Priest breastplate. The breastplate was used in a specific Masonic ritual and was meant to mimic the breastplate of judgment worn by biblical high priests. According to the Bible, the original high priest was the only person permitted to see the Ark of the Covenant, once each year on the Day of Atonement. In the opening of the ritual, recorded by Henry Franken in 1783, it states, "The place where this royal lodge or college is held, ought to be in a very secret place, and should be underground, vaulted, without either door or window, with a small trap door at top, big enough to let a brother through." This certainly sounds like a possible location involving Oak Island. Clark explains that Prescott had first been initiated into Freemasonry in Boston but later joined the Chester Masonic Lodge in 1784. That same evening, fellow Freemason and Oak Island lot owner, Captain James Anderson, also was initiated into the same lodge. Clark wonders if Jonathan Prescott, Captain James Anderson and the other members of the Chester Masonic Lodge made use of this Masonic ritual to hide a sacred treasure on the island? But who was Jonathan Prescott and what was his background and involvement on Oak Island? Dr. Jonathan Prescott was a surgeon and captain of the engineers during the 1745 siege of Louisburg. He led a company in Colonel Samuel Moore's regiment from New Hampshire. After the fall of Louisburg, he retired from the army, settled in Nova Scotia, and had large tracts of land granted to him in Halifax, Chester, and Lunenburg. Later he would be the owner of Oak Island lots 8 and 22. Prescott was originally from Boston, Massachusetts and was in Nova Scotia during the founding of Halifax. He was a very wealthy businessman, and owned a large amount of property, operating a rum distillery, accepted as currency, owning a fleet of fishing boats and was able to set the price for fish. His neighbors were some of the most wealthy and influential people in Halifax that ranged from businessmen to government officials to tax collectors. Prescott built a large home in Chester, Lunenburg County, Nova Scotia called Maroon Hall. French/Acadian prisoners of war were housed at this house and painted a portrait of Prescott and his wife, Anne, circa 1760. During the French and Indian War, he reported that the Micmac burned his house and mill twice and for the protection of his family, he spent much of his time in Halifax. Prescott was known as a generous man who took great pains to help and relieve the poor soldiers who had served with and under him at the siege of Louisburg. During the American Revolution, many of his closest friends would be arrested for sedition. Prescott continued to maintain his political connections and friendships and was safe from scrutiny for a number of years. On the founding of Shoreham, he operated a lumber mill in Chester and a lime quarry that supplied Halifax with building materials. He assumed the justice of the peace duties from Captain Timothy Houghton after his arrest for sedition. Prescott's family was in full support of the American Patriot cause. The family of Jonathan Prescott is one of the most interesting families connected to Oak Island with deep roots maintained in Massachusetts. Joseph Prescott, second son from Jonathan's second marriage, was sent to Massachusetts at a young age for the purpose of furthering his education. He would pursue medical training like his father under the guidance of Jonathan's nephew, Dr. Samuel Prescott. By 1775, Samuel was already regarded as a patriot and son of liberty. Samuel was the rider who finished the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere to warn Concord that the British were coming. Specifically, the warning was passed to Amos Melvin, who was a first cousin to Robert Melvin, another Oak Island lot owner. Joseph and Samuel were recorded as serving together at Fort Ticonderoga in 1776. Dr. Samuel Prescott would later be captured by an American privateer in 1776. He would be taken to Halifax where he would die a prisoner of war in 1777. History records Joseph as being a doctor in the colonial army with close connections with George Washington. Washington would later name one of his horses, Prescott, who he held in the greatest esteem. Another of Dr. Jonathan Prescott's sons, John, was at the Battle of Lexington, known as the place of the famous shot heard around the world. Another son, Charles Rampage Prescott, would become very wealthy at a very young age from smuggling, blockade running, and working as a privateer during the War of 1812. He would retire young and become the father of Nova Scotia's apple orchards in the Annapolis Valley. Another Prescott relative, William Prescott, was famous from the Battle of Bunker Hill, with the alleged famous order, "Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes." Jonathan Prescott, captain of the militia, became suspected of sedition from the following incident. In the afternoon of June 30, 1782, the Americans headed for Chester. Present were the Scammell, Hero, and probably, the Hope. The 3 privateers sailed into the harbor firing cannon shots. Ashore, the commander of the local militia, Captain Jonathan Prescott, assembled the men he had available and manned the blockhouse. An attempt to fire the guns there failed, due to bad powder. More powder was obtained and a few more shots fired, one of which went home to one of the privateers. The Americans then withdrew behind a small peninsula. The Americans now landed a party of armed men who marched over the peninsula. Meanwhile, Prescott had drawn up his small force on the opposite shore of the harbor. Both sides drew up and a remarkable discussion began. The Americans, Captain Stoddard, asked permission to bury their dead, of which they had none. The British captain ordered them to stack their arms, which they did. A parley began, which was probably the point of all the posturing anyway. This ended with the privateer captains dining with Prescott ashore. A suitable charade had been performed and, no doubt, much current intelligence was gleaned at supper. The story goes on to say that Prescott bluffed the privateers away by pretending reinforcements had arrived, a tale that his visitors no doubt happily concurred in. Recall that many of the Americans had relatives ashore in Chester. Prescott himself was related to serving American officers. It was not a nasty pillage and grab raid, but a charade for higher authorities. Captain Noah Stoddard was one of the captains involved with the raid of Lunenburg. As for the exchange between Stoddard and Prescott, you must wonder if more than intelligence was exchanged between them during the raid? And what exactly was transferred? It's also interesting to note that Stoddard would go on to have a successful career in business, shipping, and banking. He would later be associated in these business affairs with Warren Delano. Delano was the great-grandfather of the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. What was happening on Oak Island at that time? Was it a source of lime mining, which has been suspected from the time of the Portuguese? Was it also the site of a secret Masonic initiation chamber and lodge? Was Oak Island being used as a source of smuggling goods and spirits? Was funding for the American Revolution being kept on Oak Island? Why would FDR come and participate in a dig for treasure on Oak Island if him and his family didn't think anything was there?